of subjects that he has been working on since years. His first interest in Indian architecture initiated with his research on Chalukyan temple architecture, on which he actually wrote his doctoral thesis for the School of Oriental Art and African Studies in London. The empirical approach he introduced to the study of Indian architecture changed drastically the method of the discipline of research on Indian history and its architecture. His first book, way back in 1977, called The Hindu Temple, is still a classic and used by not only non-Indians interested in Indian architecture, but also us who want to know more about our own culture and its built environment. Since then, he has worked on several varied subjects matter from North, Delhi Sultanate and Mughal style, with a book just he published on Mughal architecture and its temple and gardens, to southern India in Hampi in 16th century, to brick temples of Bengal in East, and now recent work on late temple architecture in our country is what he's going to talk about today. This is about Hindu architecture. But then in Islamic architecture, his book on architecture of the Islamic world is still a pioneering book on the subject. Recently, he edited a series of articles published from the non-archives of Professor John Burton Page, his late teacher at SOAS, printed by a prestigious Brill. He reprinted all those articles, got it together, and printed it as one of the sources on Islamic architecture of our country. His several issues on Islamic subjects is also very noteworthy. The Penguin Guide to Monuments of India or Blue Guide for South India are the best sources to see and know this country's rich heritage. Coming to art and other related fields, he has done catalogs for several exhibitions here and abroad on the subject of sculpture, painting, textiles, or even coins. He also edited a catalogue on the image of man for the much talked Festival of India in Britain, with enormous exhibits from this country at the Hayward Gallery, London, which is still used as a key to catalogues even today. His work on vernacular architecture in India, wood traditions, and is as an editor of art since inception for 20 years, or Australian contemporary architecture, which he wrote part 1 and 2, are some of the examples of varied contributions. In fact, once he was in Australia and somebody said, why don't you do a book on Australian contemporary architecture? And he wrote Australian Architecture, book 1, which became an international success. He was called again to do another one called Australian Architecture, Contemporary Part, which also became a success. He had never done work on Australian architecture earlier. Needless to mention that many of his work are in reprints, are in great demand among the scholarly world. However, his prime contribution is to the medieval site of Vijayanagar and its period, locally known as Hampi, is very, very noteworthy. The work done by him and his colleague Dr. John Fritz since 1980, with thousands of scholars from most varied fields such as archaeology, art history, architecture history, astronomy, Sanskrit studies, epigraphy, or to even comparison of early 1819 photographs to the present day of the site is some of the examples of varied work. He got together all these varied fields and scholars and introduced them to the site and did a very, very important work on Hampi. I'm sure anyone who wants to study medieval history of the country would have to look at Dr. Michell's work for various reasons. And last but not the least, his volume on South India for AIS, the Encyclopedia of Indian Temple Architecture, his detailed and thorough work on the subject. We are very happy to have him today with us and we're looking forward to his presentation. Thank you.
Put the dates in so you know what I mean by later temple architecture, which seems still not to be a proper topic. Even though I have touched on various aspects of it, it still as a complete subject doesn't really exist. And it's worth thinking just for a minute, why is it? What are the reasons why this later temple architecture has not attracted proper attention? And I think one of the reasons is the way in which architectural history of India is defined and taught. One of the aspects that we have of this subject, both here and of course abroad, is dividing Indian architectural history into different periods. This is one way in which we tackle it. So we have the Buddhist period, we have the Hindu-Jain period, we have the Muslim period, we have the colonial period, and so forth. According to this type of division, temples belonging to these centuries would come under the Muslim or colonial periods, which of course is not a very satisfactory way of thinking about them. There's another type of division that goes into the literature. Some of you will come across books in which words like ancient, classical, medieval, modern, these types of terms are used for architecture. And these also are not very helpful because according to this type of language, these temples would be late medieval or early modern. And again, that doesn't give us really the information that we require. Such divisions collapse the complexity of Indian regional history and temple styles into categories which do not reflect actual building practice. So I'm trying to abandon them. There's also another point which is always implied in the literature, a preference for earlier phases of architecture and art in India. Late temples, these centuries, are sometimes dismissed as derivative, lacking in creative qualities, repetitive, not really worthy of attention. There's also an implication that these temples are in some ways impure because they have absorbed and adopted non-temple elements, maybe imported elements derived from maybe Islamic or even European architecture, and therefore they're sort of contaminated. They're not real Hindu buildings. All of this, I think, is, these are prejudices that we should really put aside. And then the third factor is that many of the buildings that we're interested in, some of which I'll show you tonight, do not have adequate documentation. So if you want to know about them, where will you go to find good photographs, measure drawings, historical data? So that information is often lacking. And one of the reasons it's lacking is that these temples of this later centuries are often lacking inscribed records. In earlier centuries, buildings often have written documents engraved onto the stone slabs, and they give essential data about who built them, under what circumstances, etc., etc. And this literature, epigraphy it's called, exists in translation. There's a whole scholarship of epigraphy in India going right back to the late 19th century. The trouble with these temples are that many of them are lacking this sort of data. And one of the reasons is because in these centuries, paper was much more used, and therefore such documents are probably to be found in local paper archives. And some of these archives have yet to be really gone through. So the information relevant to these temples is still lacking. And one of the examples of this would be the greatest Hindu temple in Gujarat. I would think, certainly one of the largest, is the great temple at Dwarka, which many of you must have visited and know about. We are lacking information about who actually built the temple that you can see there today. No data is available. And so there are only legends and things. We know it goes back, of course, many hundreds and hundreds of years, but the present-day temple is lacking this sort of data. So these are some of the problems we have with the subject. Now, on a more positive note, why should we be interested in these temples? Architects and architecture students, why should they bother with such monuments? And there's several very good reasons, I think. One is historical. The fact that these temples give us insights into patterns of patronage on behalf of local rulers, religious figures, and merchants, including many people who were active under Muslim and colonial states. So it gives us a whole insight into the process of commissioning religious architecture. Another factor is what you might call the practical or professional aspect of these buildings. The study of such temples reveals the survival of diverse building skills through the centuries, most likely under the guidance of guilds of master architects and teams of professional workers. And it confirms the involvement of literate specialists who set down these traditions in writing. And this leads us, of course, to things like the Shastras of Gujarat, of Orissa and Kerala. Many of these written documents about architecture relate to this period and temples of this period. So this process of building and writing about building goes on together. I don't want to suggest that people who write are the same as the people who build, but no doubt they interacted with each other, and this is totally common in these centuries. And a third factor, which is very important, is that these temples give us insights into the survival and revival of religious cults. So learn something about what's going on in terms of religious patterns in India during this period. Many of the temples that were founded or altogether reconfigured during these centuries reflect the survival, sometimes even the revival, of significant cults. For example, the wave of Bhakti Krishna worship that spread across northern India, all the way from Bengal to Gujarat, resulted in countless new temples being erected at sacred sites like Vrindavan and Mathura, as well as at dynastic centres like Jaipur and Orcha. Influential wealthy groups, such as the Jain communities of Gujarat and Rajasthan, also acted as vigorous sponsors in this period. And the rulers of newly established states often cemented their authority by supporting particular cults, especially those of powerful Hindu goddesses, and therefore this was a reason for them to embark upon building projects. So, a study of these temples gives us lots of interesting information about history, about patronage, about the profession of building and the skills of building, and also about religious patterns in India. But of course, as architects and architecture students, what you really want to know about are the patterns of design. And so now I'll stop talking without images and we'll go on to the visuals. I've divided these temples into three sort of categories. I don't want to suggest that they are exclusive categories, but they are three ways of looking at this architecture. One is to do with revivalism, the revivals and replacements, looking back in time. The second is appropriation, borrowing and absorbing other traditions which are from outside the temple tradition. And the third is what you might call innovation, inventiveness, something completely new. So now let me just... So we start with continuities, replacements, and revivals. Is this light too strong? Maybe now we need to have it turned off a little bit. So we're going to look at temples which I classify under these sorts of headings. We'll start with Ranakpur. Now all of you have been to Ranakpur. It's one of the greatest temples of Western India, 1439, so early 15th century, and it is a testament to the survival of the Western Indian temple style into the 15th century. I don't want to suggest that this tradition was unbroken. I think for a couple of hundred years such temples were not built, but suddenly in the 15th century we have this masterpiece, one of the greatest wonders of Indian temple architecture from any period. But it is a 15th century temple, not an 11th or 12th century temple, and it preserves all the elements that we know of, the clustered shikara, the little multiple shikaras, the many levels of porches from the entrances that we know from earlier times, and it has these magnificent interiors, these multi-storied domical spaces with light coming in from balconies at upper levels. Now these are all features which are known in earlier architecture, but here reconfigured on a grander and more colossal scale than we had in earlier times. And of course, Gujarat is filled with great temples dating from the 15th century onwards. Here is an example of one of the Adinata temples at the peak of Satrunjaya, probably 16th or 17th century, this one. But it has all the elements which we know from earlier times, with a few features which are new. Look at that triple shikara, the triple towered sanctuary at the end. That's not something you get really in earlier times. It's typical of the 15th century onwards. This is another great monument. This is, of course, in Jaipur. Sorry, in Udaipur. Any of you who've been there, you will have seen it, the Jagat Shiromani temple, built by one of the main rulers of Udaipur in the early part of the 17th century. It's the major temple of the city, and again it's a testament to the survival of this Western Indian style. It's a revival and I would say a continuity of this tradition into these later periods. It's one of the largest and most imposing temples of this type. Here we have Dwarka, which, as far as I can estimate, is the tallest and most extraordinary temple of them all, with this enormously clustered shikara with all these different components, eventually leading to the climax. And notice these sorts of little balconies all the way up. Let me see if I can get this working. All these little openings here. So they're chambers, one on top of the other, each one of which has a dome, which is not at all what you will find in 11th and 12th century architecture. Anyhow, this is still a mystery to me. I haven't solved who really built this, but it's an immense temple and the greatest example of this style, I think probably from the late 17th, early 18th century, on the footprint of an earlier temple. Now we're going down to Malwa. This is now Ujjain. Ujjain, this area was very much interrupted by the Sultanate invasions, and there's hardly a temple of the earlier period left intact in this part of Madhya Pradesh. This is the Mahakala temple in Ujjain, and what you're seeing here is a revivalist temple, basically of the 18th century, incorporating earlier elements. Now, the understanding of the architects in this part of India, in the 18th century, of earlier styles is somewhat imperfect. So you get a tower which looks like this, which you wouldn't find in earlier times. So it's not an accurate revival, it's an attempt at reviving the earlier styles with these clustered types of shikaras arranged here in rows, which is not, you really don't find this much in earlier styles. And the interesting thing is that the entrance porches of those verandas have reused columns from the 11th and 12th century. So this is a revivalist temple with actual elements of earlier architecture. Probably these columns come from the dismantled temple that was there, and as many of you must know, this is one of the great Jyotirlinga monuments of this part of India, so extremely important. Now at another Jyotirlinga temple, this is the one at Ellora. This is the Krishneshwar temple that was built by the great queen Ahilyabai, probably in the 1770s. We don't have a precise date that I can find just as yet. And the point about this temple, it's an 18th century attempt to revive an earlier temple style, and in my opinion it's built on the footprint of an earlier temple. There was an earlier temple here, but what you're looking at, everything you can see here is no earlier than the late 18th century. But the actual plan of the temple, the layout, and the mandapa in front follows an earlier scheme. And we know this because there are earlier structures around the temple which imply that there was a monument there in earlier times. So this is a sort of Maharashtrian attempt at reviving a Paramara style of the 10th, 11th century. And one of the features of this earlier style is this sort of band that goes up the middle. You'll find this in temples built in the 10th and 11th century in central India by the Paramaras. Here revived, not wholly accurately, but the spirit is there, and the attempt is to suggest a temple which is ancient. And like many of these monuments, it lacks an inscription giving us the historical data. And we begin to wonder, why is there no information? Why is there not an inscription saying, I, Ahilyabai, the great queen, built this temple in 17 whatever? And I'm beginning to think that this absence of historical data is totally conscious. By not putting this information, the temple is timeless, it's outside history, and therefore it is ancient. If you put the date, then it is fixing it in a particular historical way, which I don't think the patron wished. Now this is another temple which we've recently come across on the outskirts of Aurangabad, and it's also one of these Ahilyabai sort of revivalist temples. You can see from the tower, which again has these sort of clustered or these groups of little elements, not very sophisticated, but nonetheless done in brick. But the treatment of the lower walls in stone is very revealing. This is beautifully finished, and you can see it reminds us of the cave temples at Ellora and Ajanta, which are not very far away. So here is a definite conscious reference to another type of architecture. So nobody would imagine that this is a cave temple, but these types of columns, these types of brackets are known from earlier example. This, of course, is something which is later. So the very finely finished stonework of the lower part of the temple has a very revivalist flavor to it. So that gives you some idea of the Maratha revivalist architecture that we have. Now we're skipping across to Orissa. This is a place called Kaliyakote, which is a couple of hours south of Bhubaneswar, and I came across this fabulous temple. It's a Jagannatha temple, not the one in Puri, but the same cult, built most likely by a local ruler in the 16th century. And all the elements here are typical of 11th and 12th century Orissan architecture. The great Rekado, the great towered sanctuary with its huge amlaka, this ribbed motif, the element in the middle with a pyramid, again with this strange thing on top, and this truncated pyramid. This is the pyramid that stops suddenly. And all of these elements are known from earlier periods. He recreated completely anew, probably in the 16th century. This gives you an idea of the interior dome in one of the halls, one of the mandapas, and again it follows the traditional scheme of corbelled domes with little sort of carvings and then a pendant lotus. This is typical of the Orison style, revived in the 16th century. Now here is another revivalist temple. This is a place called Bharath in Orissa, and here there is no attempt to reproduce the detail and the beauty of the earlier temples. All the architects are interested in is recreating the form of earlier temples. Again, we have this very vertical type of reka d'or, this sort of, in the local term, this sort of towered sanctuary, which is almost vertical except just at the top. There's a curve with this prominent finial, with this ribbing, and then this pyramid sitting in front with the mandapa in front. So this is a standard, I would say, Orison formula, here stripped down to its essential details, so that when you go in, this is what you see. You don't see any detail, you just see the ribbing and the basic architectural components with no decoration. So completely different to this type of treatment. So it's a decorated revivalist method. This one is a reduced, stripped down method, probably 16th, 17th century. I've not been able to find so far an exact date for this. Now we go down to Hampi, which is, Sneha's mentioned, is one of the great sites of this period, because it was founded in the middle of the 14th century, and for 200 years a lot of architectural activity took place here. This is the entrance to the Vittala temple, and what you're looking at here is a ruined gopura, that is an entrance gate with a granite lower portion and a brick and plaster upper portion, now slightly ruined. And this is a revival of a Chola period formula that was developed in the 12th and 13th century in Tamil Nadu. So not only is this a revival of something from the past, it's an importation of an architecture from another region. Because this is Karnataka, this is the Deccan, and this part of India has no tradition of Tamil-styled architecture until the 15th and 16th centuries. So this is a revival not only in terms of time, but a reference to another region. And of course we can theorize why did the Vijayanagara architects import this style as their imperial mode, and one of the answers to such a question might be because this type of architecture is fully expressive of imperial ambition, and Tamil Nadu had already been absorbed into the Vijayanagara Empire. So it was an area that was part of their control, and they obviously went there, the kings, and must have commissioned some architects to come back to the capital many hundreds of kilometers away and build this revivalist architecture. This is the main sanctuary of the Vittala temple, and it's a stripped-down Chola type of architecture. So it's an 11th, 12th century formula, here simplified and reproduced in the early part of the 16th century. And see the way that the walls are done just with these very simple pilasters with little sort of niches here, and then this tower made of brick and plaster with a sort of hemisphere on the top. I mean, it's now a little bit worn away, but all the elements of it are typical of the Chola revivalist style. And this revivalist style then, from the middle of the 16th century on, starts to reappear in Tamil Nadu itself. So now we're at Kumbakonam, in the heartland of the Kaveri River Delta, and here are some of the mandapas which were built by Govinda Dikshita, one of the great governors under the Thanjavur Nayakas. And you can see they're very simple little pavilions with little revivalist towers, typical of the Neo-Chola architecture of the Nayakas of Tamil Nadu. And this is the entrance to the Nageshwar temple at Kumbakonam. It's difficult to date because, you know, this type of architecture goes right on into the 19th century. I suspect it's probably 16th, 17th century. It's a classic Tamil gopura of the type developed in the 11th, 12th century, here recreated in the 16th, 17th century. So a typical revivalist Tamil thing. And this is the sanctuary and mandapa of the Ramaswamy temple in Kumbakonam. This is dated 1620. We have a bit of historical data about this temple. And again, the same stripped down Chola style. Here's the sanctuary, which is a little bit more elaborate with all these colonnettes and this elaborate basement. A bit simpler here at the mandapa. And again, this rather steeply pyramidal tower with a sort of hemisphere at the top. Much of this plasterwork has been redone in, say, 19th and 20th centuries. But nonetheless, what we're looking at is a building no earlier than the 17th century, referring back in time to the 11th and 12th centuries. So that, I think, gives you some idea of the different things going on in Western India, in Maharashtrian Madhya Pradesh zone under the Marathas, in the Deccan, and also in Tamil Nadu, as well as Orissa. Now, meanwhile, other things are happening in India, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now look at this. This is the Karni Mata temple at Deshnok outside Bikaner, which houses the goddess that protects the Bikaner royal house. This was probably built in the 17th century, and if I told you this was a Muslim shrine, you would probably believe me. But what you have here is a piece of architecture to accommodate an extremely important goddess, a Hindu goddess, but the architectural language which is used here comes from Sultanate architecture. How else to explain this swirling type of dome and these funny little sort of vaulted and chhatri-like things? This is something which is known as the vocabulary of Sultanate and early Mughal architecture. Here used for an extremely important shrine. Now this is a mural from the palace in Dungapur, probably from the 18th century, and it shows courtly women worshipping a linga. They're doing Shiva worship in what looks like a Mughal pavilion. Now this, I wouldn't like to suggest that this is a reused Mughal pavilion. This is a type of shrine that was commonly built in the 17th and 18th centuries in the style of a Mughal courtly pavilion. And obviously there was no problem. People didn't think this was inappropriate for a Shiva worship place. And confirmation of this comes from this building. This is in Old Delhi. This is probably a late 18th century shrine. I'm sorry, I couldn't get the whole lot in. But underneath there is a linga down here. And you can see everything about it is typical of Mughal architecture. Whether the fluted dome with the acanthus leaf here, the overhang, the chhaja, the lobed arches, the decoration. There's nothing here in the architectural vocabulary to suggest what we would think of as temple architecture, but nonetheless, it is built and used and functions as a temple. And Hindu memorial architecture, which is a sort of type of temple, also repeats this vocabulary of Mughal architecture. Here we are at Maheshwar. This is a chhatri of one of the Maratha nobles overlooking the Narmada River, and you can see everything about this Hindu funerary monument is Mughal, from the type of dome, the design here on the parapet, overhang, and these brackets. The only indication of anything temple-like are these funny little sort of types of brackets that we know, of course, from Gujarat and Rajasthan temple architecture, just here at the porch to tell us that this is the most important entrance. So there's one little gesture of something which refers back. Otherwise, it's an appropriation from contemporary Mughal architecture. Now, this is the temple at Amber, the Jagat Shiromani temple, which was built in 1601 after the death of the heir apparent. And it's a mixture, which is so interesting about this temple. It's one of the great temples of Rajasthan of the early 17th century. And here at the back, we have a typical shikara, very elongated, over the sanctuary, and in front, the mandapa is conceived totally in the vocabulary of Akbar period architecture. The materials, the pilasters, the recessed arches, everything about it is something we know from palace architecture and even mosque architecture from that period. Here is the entrance to the temple. Look at the type of brackets. These we know from Akbar's architecture. This treatment with the yellow sandstone revetted onto a pinkish sandstone. The only temple elements are these little sculptures. So otherwise, it's a temple built in the current Akbari Mughal style for a Rajput ruler who was in the service of the Mughals. So here we have a slip over of different sorts of architectural traditions. Now we are at Orcha, which, as you know, was a very important place in the 16th and 17th centuries. And this is a temple known as the Radhika Bihari temple, which people don't visit much. It's on the northern tip of the island. And it has one of these classic shikara, sort of clustered shikara sort of sanctuaries. All this is familiar to us. But look at this. This is the attached mandapa with a ribbed dome and a funny little sort of hexagonal thing at the top. And all these arches, treatment of the walls, this all comes out of contemporary Mughal architecture, except for these tiny little temple models here at the corners, punctuating the corners. So it's an appropriation and adaptation of contemporary Islamic architecture in the Hindu context. This is the entrance to the temple, and see a pair of elephants, very much like the Hathi poles or the elephant gates that you would find, say, at Fatehpur Sikri, here used to emphasize the main entrance to the temple with these sort of chhatri-like sort of balconies. So this architecture which now becomes part of the Hindu world. One of the finest examples of the Mughal architecture in the service of Hindu Mughal architecture is found at Alwar. This is the Chhatri of Bhaktawar Singh, 1815. It's a beautifully built piece of architecture with a very subtle coloristic component. Pink sandstone used for the base and for the corner elements, and the central pavilions with these bungalow roofs. White marble then used for the central chamber, the lobed arches, these bungalow vaults, and then white marble with little grey strips here for the crowning dome. So there's nothing about it that we would recognize as Hindu, but nonetheless it is here used and has a function as a sort of memorial, almost like a shrine, to a ruler who was cremated. And the interior is typical of contemporary architecture with these lobed arches. You see, beautifully built, typical banister columns. Everything about it is Mughal, except for these scenes up here, which have to do with Krishna worship and Vaishnava iconography. So there's a little touch of something just to remind us where actually we are. Now, more bizarre and more interesting things are yet to follow, I think. We are now in Brindavan, which is a great mishmash of sacred architecture from all different periods, and we're at a temple called the Radha Gopala Temple, and this is now towards the end of the 19th century. We're in the 1870s now, and you can see that the European mode, or a version of the European mode, has now entered the field of Hindu religious architecture. And the patron of this temple is somebody I believe came from Lucknow, and this maybe explain the rather bizarre entrance gate with these sort of funny petals arranged like this, with lobed arches. But of course look at the European columns here, and then of course we have a chhatri on top. So it's something completely new, and there's nothing about it that's particularly Indian temple. But look at the main sanctuary. This looks like a great European villa with statuary. I don't believe the statues are Hindu gods or anything. It's like Queen Victoria up here, this sort of European model. And of course these columns, and sometimes they're twisted, all very elegant, extremely European, and this is a functioning Hindu temple. And if anybody has a problem about the style of it, I didn't hear about it. Everybody seems to be quite happy to go there to worship. And in front is, you can't see it, there's a formal garden with fountains and statues. The whole thing is conceived as a sort of villa. And this European exuberance finds some bizarre expressions. Now we are in a rural part of Orissa at a place called Nilagiri, and I came across this fabulous gateway, which I think is just too wonderful for words. But I mean, everything about it, the columns, you see, this fan light, the again clustered columns, this type of treatment, and these bizarre European English sort of lions. Not quite convincing, but nonetheless, and more lions here. Obviously, this is a local attempt to give a sort of a colonial importance to a provincial temple. And here there's a little, look at this design. This is like a pair of shutters, wooden, perfect, opening up to reveal a figure. This is something which we find also in Bengal temples. They just love doing this sort of trompe-l'oeil, this trick of the eye sort of feature. Now, this is the great discovery of mine. We are now in Panna, which is not very far from Khajuraho in the eastern part of Madhya Pradesh, and this was a princely state, and the rulers there were very interested in sponsoring an individual style of architecture. Well, this is the Baldioji temple, late 19th century. I still don't have enough historical information to satisfy me, but it seems to have been designed for the local Maharaja by his English engineer, which explains the purity of the neoclassical treatment of the temple. This is the mandapa here, which you can see has a wonderful classical sort of revivalist, neoclassical sort of wall treatment with these great double height pilasters. Look at the pediment here over the doorway with double things, a great staircase with cast iron things, and then these rather bizarre part octagonal buttresses that become sort of chhatris with European styled lanterns, and this is over the sanctuary. Not a clustered tower, but something which probably is closer to St. Paul's Cathedral in London than it is to anything in central India. Anyhow, it was something that I had read about but never seen a picture of, and I was not disappointed when I went there. And this is the interior. And it's not a great picture, but you can see these beautifully finished Corinthian columns. Look here, the Corinthian here, the treatment here, the semicircular arch, the pediment, and then the Hindu icon here. So, I mean, if I cut the picture here and told you it was one of the great churches of Calcutta, you would have no problem, I'm sure. But what we've got here is a piece of European aesthetic in the service of Hindu temple architecture. So it's really quite fascinating that these things have gone on in India. And this is one of the great discoveries I found in South Calcutta, in Toliganj. This is a temple that combines European and traditional Bengali architecture. The lower half here is sort of Doric, I would say. You see with all these columns, and a Greek, Neo-Greek frieze. Meanwhile, the sanctuaries, there are 3 sanctuaries here at the back, are topped with traditional Bengali-type ratna treatments. That is with little miniature turrets. That's a pancharatna, 5 ratnas, and here we have a 9 ratna. So this is typical indigenous, I would say, inventive Bengali architecture pushed back behind a neoclassical facade. So this courtyard in which we're standing is like a great sort of colonial villa. And of course, Goa is a place where we have all these crossovers between European and Hindu architecture. This is the Mangesh temple near Toponda, one of the many temples in that area, which do make reference to contemporary Christian architecture with all these, you can see these European elements here, these types of windows, and this octagonal lantern with a dome, which of course reminds us more of something from the Islamic world than from the Christian world, but nonetheless has nothing to do with the temple architecture of this period. So again, it's an appropriation from different traditions. And in front of the temple is this sort of lamp tower. And this, these are lit up, such towers, at festival time. And quite apart from their function of illuminating a courtyard at certain times of year, they seem to me to have an ideological function, because they are really in competition to the bell towers of old Goa, which is only about 20 kilometers away. So when, I would say, patrons sponsored this Hindu architecture in the 18th century, I think there was an idea that they wanted to compete with and maybe surpass the Baroque Portuguese architecture of the 16th and 17th centuries, and they were permitted to do this by building these sorts of lamp towers, which are more like Christian bell towers than anything else we have in India. So I think this gives you an idea of the very fertile and interesting range of appropriations and borrowings and absorptions into Hindu architecture, into temple architecture of other traditions, whether you characterize them as Sultanate and Mughal, that is Islamic, or Baroque and Neoclassical as Christian. However you term them, they are not indigenous to India from way, way back, and they have nothing to do with temple architecture, but here they become absorbed into temple. So now let's go into our third category of really creative, something really new, which doesn't refer to other traditions, doesn't borrow, doesn't look back, but maybe looks forward and creates something which maybe you've not seen before or anywhere else. And I've decided to start in one of my favorite places, Hampi, Viswanathan. Most of you will know what this is. This is the chariot shrine in the courtyard of the Vittala temple. And prior to Viswanathan, these chariot features never formed an independent structure. In Chola architecture, you get a few wheels, a few horses, but you don't get a complete shrine. This is really conceived like a model of a chariot. And originally there were leaping horses here, carved in stone. Now they put elephants, but they're not original. And these wheels even could be turned. They were not actually stuck to the axles. And there was, of course, a little brick tower on here, which was pulled down by the British in the 19th century for no good reason. So this is an inventive way of creating a chariot-like shrine for Garuda, moving towards the icon of Vishnu that was installed in the main temple. And in the courtyard of the Vittala temple, we have these sorts of mandapas, these ceremonial mandapas, which are a special development of the 16th century. There are places where certain ceremonies took place, sermons would be had, where performances of dance and music would take place, and where images would be brought from the sanctuary and placed there, especially at occasions of marriage between the god and goddess. Now, this type of architecture is not only new in terms of function, but in terms of components. Look at these columns. These are single blocks of granite cut out to make slender colonnettes and leaping animals. This type of architecture is really invention of the 16th century. And this composite column, or pier, maybe a better word, this is one block of stone. And it consists of an actual shaft with these cut-out elements surrounding it, and then actually a piece of sculpture. The whole thing worked out to support the various brackets to carry the core ceiling. And this, I would say, explosion of the column into a very complicated piece of vertical granite is something which was specialized in the 16th century and goes on into the 17th century. Here we have at Kumbakonam another example of a column shaft with an attached sculpture. And these sculptures are generally nothing to do with religious themes, but with military themes. So what we have here are leaping beasts with warriors, with weapons, and then here at Kumbakonam we have horses. You see, with Nayaka-type warriors, with swords, battling. So the column becomes an expression of the military spirit of the era, and becomes a vehicle of sculpture imagery as well as a supporting component. And that's something which I don't think we see quite like this in earlier architecture. And of course the great gopuras of South Indian temples, these gopuras of course go back to earlier times, but this type of hugely slender gopura, this is Madurai, probably 17th century. These are among the tallest such brick and plaster entrance gateways we have of any temple in the Tamil area. It's of course splendid, and any of you been to this part of India will have seen it. But this type of curved profile, this very slender type of construction with this barrel vault at the top, again is one of the inventions of the 17th century. Now we're going to make a leap back into this part of India, back into Western India. We're now at Chittor in Rajasthan. This is the Vijaya Stamba, this famous victory tower, which was built by Ranakumbha in the middle of the 15th century, after his success in battle over some of his enemies. And it's not merely just a tower, it's actually what you might call a vertical temple, because the treatment of the walls of the tower are exactly like a temple. They revive, of course, some of the sculptural themes we had in earlier times, components, these windows, these columns, all these are things which are known perhaps earlier, but here reconfigured in a way which we hardly know in earlier architecture. So again, it's something which I would call part of the inventive spirit of this later temple architecture. Towered temples, religious monuments built as towers, are also known elsewhere. We are now at Mathura, beside Yamuna, and this is called the Sati Burj. This was built in commemoration of a queen who was cremated here on the river on the 16th century, and it's again one of those monuments that is repeating for us the vocabulary of Mughal architecture, but in a way that is completely unknown in Mughal architecture, with these stories, one on top of the other, and I suspect on the top there was a spire here originally, and what you see here is the inside chamber within the spire, which that is the domical roof. But look at these brackets, exactly what you would have in Akbari period architecture. But the whole composition is something I would say quite unique, as is of course this. Now we are in Brindavan. This is the Madana Mohana temple, again late 16th century, red sandstone. And this octagonal, towered, tapering sort of building is not something we know really in earlier times that looks like this. You see it's vertical for a while, then it starts to taper, and eventually has a very, very slight curve, and then this extraordinarily enlarged amlaka, this ribbed finial. And inside, you can see, it's quite tall, there are people sitting there. The treatment of the walls has these stylized lotuses, which I must say doesn't even come out of Mughal architecture. It's something invented here in Madurai in the late 16th, in Brindavan in the late 16th century. But probably the greatest temple of this sort of inventive central Indian style is the beginning of the 17th century temple at Orcha, the Chaturburj temple. It's one of the greatest masterpieces of temple architecture that we have of this period, and it has something for everybody in it. We have here the octagonal, faceted sanctuary with the great tapering sort of octagonal tower, which is something we know from Vrindavan. And then we have a more clustered tower here on a squarish plan with facets. You see, and there are lots of things. And then we have little temple models. There would have been one here too, 4 of them on the frontal part of the monument, with this dome, this Sultanate-type dome with a hexagonal pavilion on the top. Again, something known from Sultanate architecture. Meanwhile, the treatment of the walls all comes out of Sultanate architecture, as does some of the peripheral buildings. So it's a fantastic and dramatic mingling of different elements, and I think the way in which they all go in an ascending, you see, motive, triangular, right to this climax, is very satisfying. And inside, though not in very good condition, you can see what happens. How do they roof these great crossings of vaulted spaces? And this type of architecture with a dome on a 32-sided drum, on this octagonal base with these sorts of, I guess they're sort of pendentes, really, angled pendentage, on these crossing of arches. This is something, of course, that comes out of Mughal architecture and even Sultan architecture. Here used in a Hindu, in a royal Hindu monument built by Peterson, one of the great rulers of this central Indian state at the turn of the 17th century. More inventive even is this temple at Orcha. This is the Lakshmi temple of the late 18th century, built by a later ruler of the same dynasty. And here we can no longer use categories of classification. This is just a unique monument. Everything about it is an individual assemblage of different components. It's laid out on a square with corner towers. And the towers have these flanges. You see these sort of angled flanges. They are maybe 32 points. And one of them functions as the gate. So you enter here, and then you have a square. And this tower, you see, has like an octagon to dome crown. There are 3 of these, and then 1 of these over the entrance. Standing almost freely in the middle of the courtyard is this octagonal tower which rises over the sanctuary, where the images are placed. And you can see it's divided into stories. And each level has these sorts of rather Rajput-like sort of treatments, with these openings and these bungalow-type of roofs, all drawn from various sources. And then the whole thing is crowned with a sort of pineapple dome. You see, there's sort of fringes like here, and these funny little guldastas. These are things out of Sultan architecture that go all the way down like there. So it's an innovative, I would say, assemblage of elements drawn from different architectures to create something that we've never seen before. And in a way, you could say the same of this monument. This is the temple that was built in memory of Ahilyabai at Maheshwar, the Samadhi of the Chatri, in the early part of the 19th century. And it again is this mixture of different elements, and I think a very successful assemblage. It has again this clustered tower that is maybe sort of revivalist, other types of little towers here. Then it has these pavilions, which we know, of course, from Rajput and Mughal architecture, and then it has more traditional Hindu elements here with little brackets. So the whole thing is quite a powerful and dramatically conceived building. Again, something innovative of this period. And this is where the compound to the temple is entered from the Narmada River. You could arrive by boat and you could come up these steps to this magnificent gateway, again rather like a Rajput, maybe a Rajput palace, again with a balcony where musicians and drummers could attend on you as you arrived, and various angels with wings holding up the balcony, and sculpted guardians with European-type guns. But the architecture, even though it makes references to other traditions, again is sort of unique. So I think this is something very special of the late 18th and 19th centuries. And of course these Upastambhas that some of you must know, these are like a signature of Maratha presence. Wherever you see such things, these great towers with these curved brackets, you know the Marathas had been active. They more or less invented this type of lamp tower, and each bracket would have had a lamp which would be lit on a special occasion. Hell of a job, I would have thought, these two. And these are They come from a temple called the Oasis City temple in Ujjain, which I came across. I thought they would be rather splendid and quite monumental. But they're all over the place. You find them wherever the Marathas were active. Now we're going to Orissa to give you an idea of what happened there in later times. Now you may remember the temples I showed you before had these towered domes, these very traditional towered domes, in front of which were pyramids for the dance mandapa, the nata mandapa, and the entrabhoga mandapa. Very often this trio was a big reka dome, and then a tall pyramid, and then a smaller pyramid. But look at this temple. This is a place called Kendrapara. It's a Balarama temple. It's probably 18th century. Here, the towered sanctuary has disappeared altogether, and what we have is a triplication of these towers. This is not known in early architecture. This seems to be an innovation. And it reaches a wonderful climax in temples like this. This is Kaliakote, again, this place we looked at before. This is a Gopinatha temple, probably 18th century, very, very ornate. And you can see here we have two towers, more or less the same. This one is taller over the sanctuary, and a smaller tower, a miniature version, or lesser version, over the mandapa. And the temple towers are decorated with little miniature towers. So each one of these is a little tower in itself. So it's an improvisation within an architectural tradition, creating something new. Now what about this temple? This is at a place called Nilagiri. It's the Gundicha temple, 18th or 19th century. I have no historical data. And here these pyramids are reduced to these sorts of strange angled and curved cornices. See there? Look at these. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. Anyway, here's a little bit of something that reminds us of other Orissan architecture. And then at the top we have an octagon with these curved ridges. So it's a completely new type of architecture. And I would say the climax of this innovative style, here we have something called the Panchadeva temple, because it consists of a central shrine plus 4 corner shrines, and this is in a remote part of Orissa at a place called Shonapur in the northern eastern zone. And here the towers are reduced, these curved towers are reduced to they look almost like domes. It's somewhere between a European dome and an Orissan tower. Of course, one over the centre is larger and it's faceted, probably 12-sided. And then we have this vocabulary of slightly European-type arches, but with lobes. Anyhow, the whole thing defies analysis almost, but it's a completely original and extraordinary building with these European lunettes here, these little sort of, frames with figures in them, figures in here. So this is the extreme case of inventiveness in local architectural traditions that we have in Orissa. In neighbouring Bengal, I apologise for these pictures, I didn't have good originals, we have these sorts of things going on in which vernacular traditions are translated into brick and terracotta. And this is something which is innovative because we don't have it from earlier times, but it's obvious to us that what we have here is a replication of a double thatched hut, which in Bengal is known as a jaw bungalow, here in brick with a plastered sort of surface. So it's an architecture that has nothing to do with brick construction device, but everything to refer to something from bamboo and thatch, but here realized in brick. And then the principal facade, you enter through this jaw bungalow, and you go into this bungalow, which is the sanctuary at the back. This has a terracotta tiled facade. This is one of the subjects that I came across, which helped me look at this later architecture. This is an 18th century temple. This one is at Bishnupur, 1643, so 17th century. It's a Shyamaraya temple, a Krishna temple, and this is what we know as a Pancha Ratna, because it has these 4 corner towers, and then in the middle we have something which is octagonal, though it's not very clear from the photo. So an octagonal tower in the middle, and 4 corner towers with these sorts of ridged elements. And these ridged elements, of course, go back to Orissa and earlier architecture in the area, but never are they in the centre like this. And these curved cornices, again, they don't come out of brick architecture, they come out of bamboo architecture. And again, we have this terracotta treatment. Look at this part of the building with these great massive columns and these types of arches. These come out of Bengal Sultanate architecture. And when you go in here, you will find vaulted corridors and a domed chamber in the middle, the sort of thing you would find in a mosque or a tomb of the 15th century in Bengal, here appropriated and reinvented in terms of its reference to vernacular architecture. And this type of Ratna architecture proceeds on and on and on, and here we have in the, let's see, in 1752, at a place called Kalna, on the Hooghly River, the Krishna Chandra multiple Ratna. So you see we have 12 at this level, we have 4 at this level, we have another 4 at that level, and 1 there, so whatever that adds up to, it's different stories to create this sort of pyramidal Ratna, Ratna being a term used for turret, I think, with the English word, each one with a little ridge. Again, the curved cornices, references to the bamboo and thatch architecture, and the terracotta panels here. Then you go in here, and in the middle again is a domed chamber. Now this inventiveness in Bengal continues right into modern times, and my last picture tonight is this. This is the mutt of the Ramakrishna mission at Belur, which is on the outskirts of Kolkata, and it was built in 1898, and obviously the architect was intending to make every possible reference to every bit of Indian architecture. All periods are represented here. So we have the Buddhist Chaitya arch, we have a Sultanate arch here, we have something which is, I don't know what it is, it's a sort of faceted conical dome. We have these things which look like they come from Rajput architecture. We have lobed arches which are sort of vaguely, I would say, Mughal Rajput, like these bungalows. And then we have these flat pilasters, this sort of articulation of the wall into something which is closer to European architecture, all beautifully built in stone. And it's a great shrine to the memory of this great religious teacher, and it was obviously intended to be, I would say, encyclopedic, to somehow encompass the complete range of Indian architecture so that whoever should arrive to worship should feel there was something to do with their tradition. And this type of encyclopedic architecture, I think, ushers in the 20th century, in which we have temples which do try to encompass the different regions of India, though that lies outside my present scope. Somebody really needs to do a proper history of 20th and 21st century Hindu architecture, both in India and, of course, in Europe, Australia, and North America, and Southeast Asia. That's, of course, a further extension of this subject. So, I have to thank you for your attention. It's hardly possible for me, of course, in this time, to give a totally comprehensive survey of all the later temples of India. I hope that this selection will give you some idea of the wealth of architectural materials to be discovered in this body of monuments, and if any of you can be persuaded to take up some sort of project of documenting and studying any of these temples, most of which are badly in need of such attention, then I'll be very well pleased. And I thank you for your attention.
Would it not be possible to categorize the architecture of any period into these 3 categories?
I think the appropriations from other traditions is less evident in the pre-Islamic tradition, but of course there are always these revivals going on, and there are always these inventive periods. Yes, I didn't want to say that they're exclusive to this period. It's just one way of helping us look at these monuments, and of course many monuments have all these elements in them. I don't want to suggest they're exclusively one thing or the other, but I agree with you, yes, of course.
Couple of things come to my mind. One of them is the way one would define define development and eclecticism. and therefore a certain product coming up. And second was, it's more a kind of a suggestion rather than a question. What happens in Goa and the form that comes up in Goa has its own reasons, political reasons why it happened. And Mangeshi has been built over and over again compared to the many other temples in Ponda and other places. So would you take into cognizance such causative reasons which made these temples the way they were of that period?
I think the historical, political and cultural background to these monuments is extremely important. And what I've discovered is in trying to explore these circumstances that there is no single history for this period that I'm interested in. What I've concluded is that there are regional histories. And each part of India has its own set of circumstances and reasons why and how temples were built. One can't generalize for the whole country. So in the book that I'm hoping one day to write, I've divided India into sort of almost 20 different regions. Goa will be one of them because it has a different pattern. Gujarat and Rajasthan, for example, have completely inverse historical circumstances in terms of temple patronage. Gujarat is very active under the sultans in terms of temple architecture, but not particularly active under Mughal rule. Meanwhile, Rajasthan, until the Mughals get there and the Rajputs get going, only then is it particularly is the subject for an individual study. The late architecture of Rajasthan, the late temple architecture of Maharashtra, for example. What I'm trying to do is, will it be possible in one textbook to sketch out the subject so that students and interested people can say, okay, now it's a subject, why don't we take one of these chapters and go further? Michell has only touched on it, he hasn't gone nearly far enough, his information is not reliable, let's push it to the next step. Because this is a research process, and I feel that it's slipped. This topic has slipped out of view, and because I've worked in Bengal on a project, I've worked in Hampi, I've done a little bit of thinking about architecture on the Marathas, I've had a little bit of a chance to get into these different areas. Two areas I did not mention, Mickey, which you know, of course, Kerala, I didn't mention at all, and Himachal Pradesh, which seem to me have completely different patterns, rather outside these historical, it's a different sort of thing going on, requires a different treatment, as you know. So, what I'm presenting to you is a work in progress, bear with me, but there's lots of interesting things to explore and so much to discover in India.
It's indeed very, very exciting kind of exploration that has come up. My questions are a little bit pertinent in terms of, even if a small note about places like Goa would help the reader and the workers who do the further work a lot. The last slide. This is different from what I said before. It's very interesting that this 18th century, 19th century monument gets replicated again in Rajkot in 20th century. And the technology changes, everything changes, but the form remains. So it's a very good example where just to put the same building from Rajkot this way would give a fantastic kind of finale to the kind
is this a temple? Is this a temple in Rajkot?
In Rajkot. And Krishna Mission.
Oh, I see. Okay.
The same. Krishna Mission. And done by a Gujarati architect. Thakur had done this. Thakur's
in the 20th century, was it already?
Yeah.
No, the 20th
yes.
century.
And it's
okay.
It's a wonderful example of what you are trying to say at the end to culminate with this too.
Well,
1976.
Sorry.
So Rajkot temple was being built in 1975-76.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Just quite brief. In fact, I guess what I have to do, I haven't yet had the courage, is to have an appendix, the whole subject of into the 20th and 21st centuries, with a few key examples, and the Rajkot one, which I've never been to Rajkot, but I'm going in January. I must try to check out this Ramakrishna mission.
This would be wonderful. And even if you can't go, let us know. We'll provide.
And does it replicate the Belur?
Absolutely.
It's a sort of a
100%. 100%.
This, I think, is a splendid building. It's beautifully built, I have
And
to
by
say.
a Gujarati architect
Right.
named Madhukar Thakur.
So it must have been a signature of this mission, this type of architecture.
Absolutely. They
Must have
wanted
recognized
it,
it.
repeated.
Yes. And I think this so-called eclecticism, we have to think of positively, not negatively. Because when I was brought up, educated in the rigors of 1960s modernism, it was a very puritanical period, I have to say, not at all creative. We were all told that words like eclectic were dirty. We were not allowed. So, now you are much easier, all of you students now, you've got much more freedom than we had who were students. We weren't allowed to think about eclecticism or revivalism. These were, of course, just not allowed. So I think we have to open up our minds to what are the positive aspects and what are the aims of such an architecture.
That note of not calling eclecticism that way was very clear in your lecture. Thank you.
Good. Well, I hope so. I mean, I don't have any problem using it, but I want to use these words with a very positive way. Somebody at the back, yes.
This is the Dakor temple. The Dakor, there is a very famous Krishna temple, which looks like a Gurudwara. See the photograph, it looks like Gurudwara. So maybe it will be very interesting if you see it just 2 hours from here, from Ahmedabad.
Which place?
Dakor. Dakor.
Okay. Near Bharath. Oh, see, okay. No shortage of examples. The problem is we need to make a selection. Otherwise I will never get through it. It's always a great pleasure to hear a man who is excited by what he sees. And always that is the case with George. Thank you very much, George, for giving such a wonderful series of experiments to us to think about. It's not normal that we see such things. And your latest phase of research seems to be explosive in its potentials. Explosive, I mean, in the sense that, if anything, this school is somewhat Puritan in a certain tradition of a rather pure kind. I wonder what we tell our students. I wonder what we talk about when we talk about cut and paste, for example. I'm provoking a certain debate later to follow, not criticizing what you have found. But I think that there is a very, very interesting point in time where that somewhat exclusive mode of thinking loosens up and enjoys an absorption. And I think it's very good to know that we have been doing this for the last 5 centuries. And therefore there is nothing to worry about really. And we ought to relax. Thank you very much, George. On behalf of
It's my privilege to thank a number of people because this is the last lecture in the first lecture series that is organized by the Alumni Association of the Faculty of Architecture. So, first of all, I'd like to thank all the speakers who came. You're here. A whole bunch of people traveled from long distances to give this talk, and first thanks are due to the speakers. Second, to the school for hosting the lectures, particularly for Chaya and Pratyush for having helped coordinate the whole lecture series, and the students for being enthusiastically present. Today there are fewer students because most of them are away on related study projects, perhaps measuring and documenting some of the techniques that you want to see. I'd also like to thank Namrata Patel, who is the administrative person in the Alumni Association. She has done a lot of behind-the-scenes work to make all of these lectures possible. Of course, next comes Chirayu Bhatt, who has also done a lot of the behind-the-scenes work to make these lectures possible. Of course, biggest thanks are due to Snehal for having organized this entire lecture series for us. He put his considerable energies, all of his resources into making this a great success. Many of the people that came here, most of the people came here because they are personally known to him, and they came because Snehal asked them to come. So thank you very much for making all of this possible for us. And finally, I'd like to thank the alumni. When we started the lecture series, the idea was that we were all starting to think we must create an alumni association, we must get invited, we must do this to contribute to the school. But long before the alumni association was registered or was formed or there was any, we said let's start doing the work of the alumni association. And therefore we thought of this lecture series. And it became really possible to do that because, well, a bunch of people financially supported these lecture series. Today, at present, the Alumni Association has 192 contributors and we have collected a lot of money. But in that very first instance where we wanted to start the project, there were 10 or 12 people who generously gave a loan of 1 lakh rupees each to be able to get the activity going. And I'd like to thank them very much. I don't want to name them individually, but thank you very much for all of that. So with that, I conclude. This is the last lecture in the first lecture series. And next year, we go ahead and maybe do the next one. But I understand there's a gift to be given to George. So George here.